Hey guys, it's Kesara, and today I'm going to be doing part 2 of my mini-series, So You Think You Want to Read Adult High Fantasy. And in this video, I'm going to be giving you guys recommendations for bridging the gap between YA to adult. So most of the books that I'm going to be recommending in this video are actually going to be YA books that I think work really well as a bridge between YA and adult. But I'll also make a few recommendations of adult books that I think are really great for people who typically read YA books that they will probably really love, but they are actually adult high fantasy. So this is broken up into 2 parts, so we're gonna start with the first one, YA books that almost read like adult fantasy books. So the very first book that I have to talk about in this video is the YA fantasy book that got me into adult high fantasy, and that's Eragon by Christopher Paolini. This is the first book in the Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini, obviously. This book is about a village boy named Eragon who finds a dragon egg in his backyard, and he hatches the dragon egg and becomes a dragon rider. It has all of these classic high fantasy tropes that you see in tons of adult high fantasy novels, but it's packed into this YA novel that is so easy and fun to read. I love this entire series. It is the ultimate like YA fantasy series. So if you want to read high fantasy and you haven't read this, you should definitely pick it up because it's fantastic, and it's definitely the type of series that'll make you want to read adult high fantasy because it has all of the tropes that you would expect from adult high fantasy novel, but in a way that's really accessible to younger readers and to readers who haven't read a lot of high fantasy, because even though they're still really thick books, like this is probably the shortest of the 4 books in the series, they're really easy to read and they have great characters, great world building. I absolutely love the world building in this series. It's very similar to Lord of the Rings and, like I said, a lot of the other classic high fantasy series, but while Lord of the Rings is a little less accessible, the Inheritance Cycle is really easy to read, and of course there's dragons in it and dragon riders, and there's tons of lore and world building in this series that just makes this the perfect starter series for a high fantasy reader. So I would highly recommend this one, and this is the one that actually made me fall in love with the genre. So of course, nostalgically, it also holds a place in my heart. So I would be remiss if I also didn't mention Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. So this is a duology following a group of characters who are going on this heist. I think this works well as a bridge between YA and adult as well, mostly because I feel like some of the themes that this series explores are a little bit more mature than your typical YA themes, while it's still written like a YA book, because this is written by Leigh Bardugo, who is like an iconic YA fantasy author, but it definitely delves into some more mature themes, and it has some ideas that you start to see in adult grimdark fantasy, just not as dark as you would expect from your typical like adult grimdark fantasy book, but it starts going in that direction, and because of that, I feel like this would be just such a great bridge from YA to adult. I also really love the characters in this book. All of the characters are so well developed. It's the characterization that really drives the story, which is also what you find in adult books a lot, is the characters are really what drive the story, which I think the Six of Crows duology is a great easy series to read that has more of that style. So I really enjoyed this. I think it has some really great characters that are really fun to follow and a great plot line, but with more maturing themes that can read a little bit older. Like, I would almost consider this a new adult series rather than a YA series because of the themes that it explores. So the next book I want to talk about is The Arithmetist by Brandon Sanderson. I think this is a really great starter novel as well for someone who wants to go from YA to adult, because Brandon Sanderson is typically an adult fantasy writer, but he wrote The Arithmetist in the YA genre, and The Arithmetist is definitely a really fun YA fantasy novel that I absolutely loved. Like, I went into this expecting pretty much nothing, and I loved it. It has a very interesting magic system that is really well developed and characters that you just want to stay with the entire time. It's written in Brandon Sanderson's kind of like typical, like very plot-driven, action-packed writing, while at the same time bringing in tons of great world building, and I feel like it's just a really good introduction to Brandon Sanderson if you want to read mostly just YA fantasy. And if you like this book, there's a good chance you'll like a lot of his other books, and he has a ton of adult high fantasy books, which I think are pretty good starters to the adult high fantasy genre. So if you're not sure if you're gonna like his writing, definitely try out The Arithmetist, because it is just a fun, fast-paced book that I personally really loved, and hopefully at some point we're gonna get a sequel to, and it can definitely give you a taste in what Brandon Sanderson's writing is like with a YA fantasy book before jumping into some of his larger books. So a pretty recent find for me that I have to include in this is A Crown of Feathers by Nikki Papreto. So this is a book that came out, I believe it was last year, and this is about Phoenix Riders. So it is about a girl named Veronica and her sister Val. They are orphans and they want to become Phoenix Riders, but Phoenix Riders are kind of really rare because there was this war in the past where a lot of the phoenixes died. So at the beginning of this novel, they're looking for phoenix eggs to hatch so that they can become Phoenix Riders. Things happen and Veronica ends up joining this other group of Phoenix Riders in which she has to pretend to be a boy boy in order to join the group. So it has some really great like classic YA fantasy tropes, such as a girl pretending to be a boy and this like training academy sort of thing. But it also has some of the more adult fantasy tropes, which is like magical creature riders and some other things that I don't want to say because it gives spoilers away for the book, and you should definitely read this because this is one of my favorite books that I read last year. It also has really great world building and lore in this book in a way that I don't typically see from YA fantasy. There's a lot of history here, and there is some really great unlikable characters that I really enjoy as well. And I really love that there are multiple character point of views, so you get to see the story from many sides as well. I would highly recommend this one. This was one of my favorite books from last year, and the third book in this series is coming out next year, which I'm also really excited for, but this one is definitely a really good bridge from YA to adult. Okay, so now we're gonna be switching into part 2 of this video, in which we're talking about adult fantasy books that are really great for people who typically read YA books. So the first adult series that I want to talk about is Red Sister by Mark Lawrence. I absolutely love this trilogy. It's about a girl named Nona who I believe she's an orphan at like the beginning of the series, but she's taken to a convent and is trained as a killer basically and in magic. And even though this is considered an adult fantasy novel, it has a lot of the aspects that you would expect from a good YA novel, in the fact that the very first book especially is definitely a coming of age story for Nona as a character. Nona is a little bit of an eccentric character. She has a great personality and is the type of strong female character that you would expect from a YA fantasy book. And the first book also is set in a very much a training setting, and there are like different school years and levels that the students have to get to. So for those reasons, it has a lot of the building blocks that you would expect from a YA fantasy novel, but it's an adult fantasy book, and I absolutely love that aspect of it. I also feel like while Mark Lawrence has a lot of the detail and like complexities that you want from a good adult fantasy book plot, he leaves out a lot of the details, more of like the info dumps that you would expect from an adult fantasy book that would make a book like this that is relatively short be twice this size. So that's why I think Mark Lawrence is also a really great starter author if you want to get into adult fantasy but you're a little scared of like the longer, like more world buildy type of books. His books tend to be just way more action packed and fast paced, and definitely more accessible to readers who are coming from YA, which are generally also more fast paced. I absolutely love this series. It's about killer nuns, so that's really cool, and it is just a fantastic trilogy that I would highly recommend. So this last book is the only book on this list that I kind of hesitate to recommend to you guys, and that's because I personally didn't love it, but it's a very beloved book, and the reasons why I didn't love it are why I think it would actually be a good bridge from YA to adult, and that's Nevernight by Jay Kristoff. So Jay Kristoff is a pretty well-known author for YA books. Nevernight is an adult fantasy book that he wrote. I personally didn't love it because I felt like it read a little too young for me, while at the same time having way too mature content, kind of the audience level that it was going for, because it kind of read like a YA book for me, but the content was a lot more mature than you would expect from a YA book. It had some really good aspects to this that I really liked because it is action-packed. This is about a school of assassins, and there are like really good hints at world building there, but it doesn't go as in-depth as I would expect your typical like adult fantasy novel to. But because of that, I do feel like it would be a good bridge for people who typically read YA books to read an adult fantasy book and see if they like the type of themes and things that adult fantasy books explores. This also has a little bit more of a grimdark aspect to it, so if you're interested in grimdark fantasy, this is another one that I would recommend if you typically read YA. And it has a great main character. It's definitely a fun, fast-paced book. I personally didn't love it because it read a little bit younger to me than I typically would have liked, and I didn't like the narrator of the book because it has a very unique narrator. I'm just very nitpicky about those sort of things, but I do think this book could be a really good bridge from YA fantasy to adult fantasy. So that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys enjoyed watching. I post videos on Sundays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, so consider subscribing. And if you'd like to be notified as soon as I upload, you can click that little bell icon. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up to support my channel. All social media links are in the description down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.